Welcome to the show. Do you ever wonder how to add stories to a talk or presentation? Do you ever find it difficult to do so or stress out about what kind of stories should I be including? Where can I even find these stories? People often do worry about adding stories to their presentations. Should they be personal? Should they be other people's stories? Maybe a mix of those, funny stories. And they maybe even worry about how to introduce and tell those stories inside of a keynote presentation. This is part 4 of my keynote creation series. If you haven't already caught the first 3 parts, please do go back and watch. They're pretty short episodes, very consumable. And I'm taking you through my keynote creation process for a keynote that I will be delivering and selling as a speaker this year, and want you to see how that process goes for me. So hopefully it helps guide you in your process as well. So by the end of this episode, you will know how to find stories for your presentations, what kinds of stories to use, what kinds of stories not to use, and why stories are essential for effective communication. Welcome to Present Influence, the show that helps business leaders develop the skills to influence, impact, and inspire. My name's John Ball. I'm a keynote coach, professional speaker, and your guide on the journey to leadership level communication and presentation skills. My mission is to provide rising business leaders like you with everything you need to be able to maximize your impact and present with influence. You can follow the show on your favorite podcast apps for weekly episodes and interviews with influence experts. So let's get into things for today. If you have already caught the previous episodes, you'll know that we've already explored things like choosing your topic, creating the structure and outline for your presentation, creating a framework for the presentation, and now it's important to start to look at adding some stories into that framework so that we can really connect and get our message across to our audience. And that really is one of the keys for stories. Storytelling is essential in communication, especially from a platform. Any kind of didactic environment, if you are teaching in any sort of way, even if your presentations are really epidictic, which would mean that they are more on the inspirational side of things, you're still going to have a level of deliberative teaching within those. There are going to be points that you want to get across to your audience. And stories are a great way to do that. Whatever capacity you may be wanting to share information at whatever level, stories help people to understand information. Being able to see things in practical application can really help your audience to put things into a correct frame in their mind and to see how what you're explaining to them can and should be utilized. There are many people out there who are doing coaching just in the area of storytelling. That is how important this is as a craft. And it is essential to being a good keynote speaker and a good communicator. Being able to use story and metaphor helps your audience to understand things, helps them to make connections in the right kind of way. And that's really what we want to do. Help them to be able to make the right kinds of connections and to deeply understand what we are sharing with them. The other good thing with stories is they tend to stick in our brains far more than anything else. In fact, what you will find again and again is that presentations that don't contain stories are going to be much more forgettable than presentations that do. Now, that said, if the stories are boring or irrelevant, then that may not be strictly true. But in general cases, storytelling, when it's done well, when it explains things well, can really captivate an audience. It is potentially one of the most important elements of your talk, even though it might not feel like it. What stories can also allow people to do is to see things from their own eyes or from a different perspective than their own. And that is great for being able to reframe particular situations and get people on board for new ideas and understanding. They're not being told what to do or what to think. They are having something presented to them that is going to help lead them to making a conclusion or decision or generating an idea for themselves. As a reminder, for those of you who have tuned into previous episodes on this, and especially for those who haven't, there is a story to go with each of the key principles for my talk, which should be the case for yours as well. So I've created a structure, an outline for the talk. I know what the principles, the key message is going to be for the talk. We have a framework. It's a 9-point framework. We're only going to be delivering 3 key elements of that, maybe 4 if we have to do a slightly longer talk. So the first element of that in my talk is going to be about finding your vision, which is essentially going to be on the importance of creating goals and purpose and direction for yourself. Now, when I was thinking about that, I thought, I know I'm already thinking of some personal stories for other elements of the talk. So for this, I really wanted to refer to something that is relatable for a lot of people. And even though it is quite well used, I wanted to tell a story a little bit about Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning. And essentially because what he ended up developing was something called logotherapy, a therapy to help people find purpose in their lives. And that's what I want this key principle in my talk to be able to do with the audience, get them thinking about creating purpose, direction in their own lives and choosing what that's going to be and understanding how much more fulfilling that life tends to be when we are purposeful in our lives rather than just meandering and floating through life without purpose and direction. So that's going to be the first one I want to use. I don't want to go too much into Frankel's experiences in the camps other than to summarize them and then really talk about why the meaning he applied to that situation was so important, helped him survive that whole thing. But then really what I want to get into is what he saw with people who had been through those experiences, who felt like they'd had everything ripped away from them, of course, and had been through major trauma and was struggling to find any purpose or happiness or joy in their lives once again. So his therapy was able to help people to start to do that once again. And certainly, if it can have any benefit for people who've been through something as extreme as a concentration camp experience, it can help the rest of us as well. In the next key point of the talk, which is called Enjoy the Ride, this next section is about being more present. So I want to help people enjoy their experiences and be able to take themselves off operating on automatic for a while. Have those moments where you can stop and smell the roses, enjoy, appreciate what you're actually getting the opportunity to be doing right now, and be in the moment, in the now, because very often our brains are thinking about what's coming up more than anything else, or thinking about something we did or said previously that might be playing on our brains. These things can even keep us awake at night. But when we're more in the now, in the present moment, we are able to think more in the moment. We're able to relax more. We actually have more opportunity available to us. Our brain's more flexible when we are operating in the present, and we tend to have greater fulfillment and awareness. And certainly when we give other people the gift of our presence, it tends to deepen relationship. In fact, it is one of those things that the quality of your time with other people is often far more valuable than the quantity of it. So you could spend a whole week with somebody, but not really be there and be present with them. But an hour or a day of being with someone and being really present with them is going to have much more impact and is going to develop closeness and trust in that relationship. So that is really something we want to aim for. And this isn't just in our personal lives, where it certainly has an impact, but also in our professional lives as well. How many times do we maybe find ourselves in a meeting with someone or talking to someone where they're clearly distracted, or maybe even checking their phone or looking at their watch, and they're not really tuned into what's being said. They're not really listening to you and listen. They're not really listening to you and giving you their full presence. If you are a coach, if you do any kind of coaching or consulting, and you are the person who's not really paying attention, who's not really fully present with a client, that will probably and rightly be called out by your clients, and should be hopefully called out by yourself as well. Is to certainly know that's correct in those situations, that you do need to be fully present when you are working with a coaching client or a consulting client. But why not take that into all areas of life? Because even in our professional lives, we are coaches a lot of the time in many of the situations that we find ourselves in. Being fully present actually shows people that we are listening to them, that we're tuning into them. So I want to include here things like that we can be doing active listening, which isn't just going and yeah every few seconds to sort of like say, oh, let's keep the conversation going, but maybe even repeating some things back. Or when you said this, is this what you meant? Asking some questions, or all right, you just said this, is that right? Am I understanding this correctly? So we check in for comprehension. We show the person we're really listening to them and hearing their words and seeking to understand them. That's a level of being really present with somebody. And sometimes even just holding space for people to be able to think and work through things without trying to rush them along can be a really powerful way to be present with them as well. So it's a lot of things to go into here. What I wanted to include as a story to talk about how important this is was essentially in my past life as a flight attendant, which a long time ago, even though it doesn't, even though time-wise it doesn't feel like so long ago, it was gosh, over 15 years ago now. And one time that had a few hairy experiences. When you're flying pretty much every day or at least several times a week for your work, you're bound to have a few experiences over years that might even put you off flying if you weren't used to them. One of those experiences for me, and I was actually debating between whether to choose a landing gear failure or flying on September the 11th, 2001. Now, the thing is, the flight on September the 11th, for me, we were halfway across the Atlantic. We got turned around. It wasn't especially traumatic. There were some incidents, and yeah, it was horrifying to be hearing over the radio in the cockpit, because we were sometimes going and listening, what had been happening. And certainly when we were at altitude, that was concerning, but it wasn't traumatic in any way to what people who were on the scene were experiencing, or even to watching the footage when we actually got back home, which was far more traumatic than that. So the landing gear failure for me felt like more of a high intensity situation. That was more of the do or die, like imminent imminent danger. And the purpose of that story for me was just knowing that we were being told that the landing gear wouldn't come down. We didn't have enough fuel to keep circling around, so we were going to have to land and do what they call a belly landing. And that was very scary because the planes have engines, they carry lots of fuel and things, and landing without the landing gear is definitely not something that you would choose to do. However, those kinds of moments can be where you might choose to either panic and stress yourself out, or you might actually have a moment of clarity, which is what I did, where I decided, like, if I'm going down, if we're going down, if this is it, then I want to go down peacefully. I want it to, I want to accept my fate and just deal with it. I've had a good life and be happy for all those things. And if I can, I want to help as many people as I can in this situation right now, and at least be here for the passengers. And that was the whole story for me of being really present in that, knowing that we might actually, crash and things might turn serious. We might not all even survive this kind of thing. There was a good chance of survival, but we might not. And that got very scary. But it was a great wake-up call for me personally into being really present in that moment with my own thoughts and myself and the people that I was with and showing them some love and care, and for the people who were passengers on that flight as well. So that's the story I decided that I'm going to use here, landing gear failure for key point 2. I'm going on then to key point 3, which is about leaving complaining and criticizing behind. And so the whole idea here is, not taking things personally, but also not bad mouthing other people or complaining about your own situation. Not to the whole thing of, if you get served bad food in a restaurant, not sending it back or anything. Of course, you should do that, but not whinging about it or not feeling like the universe is against you or anything like that because your steak was cold or whatever it is. It really is much more about being able to control our responses to things and taking responsibility for our own thoughts, for guarding our own thoughts, and for acting with what the Stoics might call greater virtue. If you've ever read The Four Agreements, wonderful book, Don Miguel Ruiz, wonderful book. I love The Four Agreements. In fact, I love the Fifth Agreement as well. But in The Four Agreements, two of the key ones here are about not taking things personally and being impeccable with your word. And I think that ties into both of these as well. I wanted a story that was going to reflect it, but also had a bit of humor in, because that key point 3 is like, in most of my talk experiences, is going to be the critical, the last point that key point 3 is in most of my talks is going to be the last point that I get to. And I wanted to have a bit more humor. And so I chose here to tell a story about when my grandfather remarried. He was already quite old when my grandmother died, and he wasn't very capable at looking after himself, bless him. And he ended up getting remarried to a friend, to someone that he knew had been friends with her. My grandparents had been friends with her and her husband for many years, and her name was Mona. And it couldn't have been a more appropriate name. So and there's some humor here. Like, she was one of those people um, who would absolutely do her very best to piss you off, and she could walk into a room and suck all the air out of it and just wither you with a few words. She was absolutely offensive, but would act innocent about it. So she would like say the most horrible things, and then just have face like butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, kind of thing. There's some definite humor in this. And she knew, she knew exactly what she was doing and stuff. But really what I want to get with the story is how that made people around her feel. The effects that that had on family and friendships, and the actual pressure that put on situations of she was not someone you would want to spend time with if you had the choice, generally. Now, I understood my granddad's reasons for wanting to be with her. He wanted to be taken care of, and she actually did a great job of that. And for all her faults, we were pretty grateful for that. The other side of that, though, was we absolutely hated having her come to visit. For mainly these reasons, because she was an absolute nightmare of a person. No, you're not supposed to speak ill of the dead, but there's some humor in this, and it's nothing, and really nothing so not degrading or horrible out there. Really, just the facts and reality of our experience, of my experience, of my family's experience in dealing with someone who was pretty much a nightmare brought into the family at that late stage of my granddad's life. So that can be a somewhat fun. I'm going to keep that very light. I'm going to keep that whole thing very light, but it's going to make a really clear point about the kinds of people who insult and moan about everything, and absolutely perfect that her name was Mona for that particular element. And so these are stories, well, clearly the key point one is not my own story, but I am going to talk somewhat in there about my own experience from reading and understanding Man's Search for Meaning. But where do these stories come from? Because key point two and key point three, these are personal stories. And I do personally think it's a good idea to have a mix of personal and non-personal stories. You may even, in certain professional talk, where you're perhaps maybe not so much on the inspirational side, where you are more teaching specifically, you may actually want to make sure you include case studies as part of the stories that you have here as well. And you can certainly use elements of case study and story mixed together if you want to be really advanced with doing that. I've seen that done very well in certain presentations, often in online presentations. Certainly my favorite resource on storytelling is from Matthew Dix, who's a really good author and such a nice guy as well. If you want to hear me talking to Matthew, it was a long time ago, but you can go back to episode 36 or 38. I had to split the episode into two parts. It was such a good but long conversation with so much value. So episode 36 and episode 38 is part two of that interview. You can go back and listen to me in conversation with Matthew Dix about Storyworthy. And it's such a good book that gives away so many storytelling secrets and gives you a very clear how-to of how to put these together, how to tell your stories from the stage. So I do recommend it. It's my favorite resource. It also gives some really good clues on how to find stories for yourself. And one of the things that Matthew recommends in the book is creating what he calls homework for life. I know he won't mind me telling you about homework for life, because I'm telling you because it is from him. I'm not telling you it's something that I've come up with. It certainly isn't. And I've had similar things from other like coaches and courses and programs that I've been in as well, of creating these stories for yourself. He has some really great strategies for creating these stories, but homework for life is his favorite one, because very often the stories that have the most impact and meaning are ones that just come up from our daily life, but we lose so many of them because we don't keep track of them. So what he recommends is creating a spreadsheet for yourself where you just note into that at the end of the day the most story worthy thing or things that have happened that day. And that way, you start to keep a record of all these things. And you might want to make a note of why it was story worthy or add a little detail, but you're not going to write the whole story then and there. You're just going to give yourself the prompt and the reminder of what the story, what the thing was, and what made it story worthy. And from there, you have a resource that you can dip into at any time and go through and find various opportunities for stories that are going to fit with the elements of a presentation that you have and might be the most appropriate. I have no problem at all with people who want to put all personal stories, but I do think it's a good idea to not go the other way of having all impersonal stories, simply because personal stories, even just one personal story in your presentation, is going to give you a better opportunity to connect with your audience. They're going to feel like they know more about you when you share a personal story with them. So that is an opportunity for vulnerability and for real sharing and connection, a connection moment with your audience. And even in professional settings, that's really valuable. It can be a really powerful tool to put into this. And in these days where we want more, well, we do seem to want more emotional intelligence and connectivity in our professional relationships. Stories can be a great way to help you introduce that and have more of it. There are personal stories that I would generally avoid. Give you one example of this. Now, some of you may know that I've, for many years, worked with the great Harv Eker and his organization. And at one time, I can remember Harv telling a story from stage about dancing at an event, and he was dancing with a very attractive woman and getting very aroused from the whole thing. I would generally steer clear of those kinds of stories. Now, he made it work. He got away with it, but I think talking about things, even any in any kind of professional setting, certainly talking about things like sexual arousal is probably inappropriate, and I would steer well clear of it. I would also steer clear of stories that make you look stupid, because you might want to have some funny stories, but you don't want them to be self-denigrating. You don't really want them to make you look unreliable or stupid, that somebody might not actually want to work with you and think, "Oh, that was dumb." So you don't really want to do yourself down with the stories that you tell. You're certainly okay to have a little bit of joke at your expense, but not something that's actually going to make people think less of you. Being vulnerable or having, showing that you can at least laugh at yourself is great. And handled right, that can still be very funny. We're not looking to make a complete fool of ourselves just to have a humorous story in a presentation. That kind of vulnerability is probably not going to serve you so well, especially in professional settings. So I would steer clear of that too. Also, steer clear of stories that, for mates' nights out, whether it's with the lads or the girls. Some of the stories you may tell to your friends are not going to be appropriate for telling from the stage, and the way you tell them might be a little different as well. So you really want to be telling appropriate stories. Use your common sense. If you're not sure, get some outside advice. I will say this though, and this is particularly from people from the UK. Very often, when people from the UK want to tell humorous stories, funny stories, they tend to go straight to embarrassing situations. And very often, those are things like getting caught out, not being able to get to a toilet. Maybe they soil themselves, maybe they wet themselves, being caught, being locked out of a hotel room naked, those kinds of things. These are not appropriate stories, and they're really actually not that funny, and they're not very original either. So I would steer clear of those in any kind of setting, and just know that most people have had that kind of situation, and it might be funny with friends and family, it might be funny in the moment, but generally those stories are not that funny. So I would steer clear of them. If you're trying to go for humor, try and get it in a different way. Most of us will have personal stories, family stories, things we can use and get some humor from, but it doesn't need to be offensive. It doesn't need to be punching down. It doesn't need to be making anybody into a complete idiot or an object of ridicule, especially yourself. So do avoid that. If you do want to do that and you find a way to make it work, I'd love to hear about it, because I think that would be very challenging, and that would probably mean that you're a very gifted storyteller to be able to make those things work. But I think you'll find, even in things like Moss story competitions and story slams, that they tend to discourage people from those kinds of stories for those similar reasons. They're very common. Most people have those kinds of stories, and most people don't find them funny. I would also stay well clear of some of the parabolic stories that people use a lot of the time. Things like, and I've used it myself, but stories like the Chinese farmer. If you haven't come across that one, the Chinese farmer, he has his son finds a horse, and the neighbors all gather and say, "Oh, you found a horse, very lucky." And then the horse is wild, it throws his son off, and the son breaks his leg. The neighbors gather around and say, "Oh, you're very unlucky." If you haven't, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but if you haven't heard it all, it's really just the principle of, you don't know if it's good or bad luck, because it's just maybe seems that way in the moment, but it actually might work out to be good in the future. So maybe reserve judgment. It's a great principle, but the story gets used a lot. There's one about the stonecutter, or the mason, and one of them is like, "Well, I'm carving stone," and the next one says, "Oh, I'm building a cathedral," and the next one says, "We're creating a divine home for people to come and commune with God and the angels," or something along those lines. And so it's the different forms of vision that people have doing exactly the same job. So perspective is everything. It's so common. I've heard it used in talks several times, at least. I would stay away from the more cliched stories unless you can find a way to make it interesting or different to how most people would tell it. If you really want to get some stories off the ground now that you're looking to put into your talk, I recommend an exercise that I got from Matthew Dix, where you might do first, last, best, worst. So you create your first, your last, your best, your worst. For might be things like car, your first car, your last car, your best car, your worst car, your pet, first pet, last pet, worst pet, best pet, those kind of things. And go through things like that. First kiss, your first date, best, worst, and all of those. You will find story material from going through that. So it's an exercise that you could do in a group or with a few friends, if other people who want to work in the two. A great thing to do in a workshop for storytelling if you're looking to come up and create stories for yourself there for your talks. So that gives you another resource to be able to find stories to put into your talks. I would say the most important thing with putting stories into your talks is that they are the most appropriate stories that are going in there. The ones that you use, the best stories you have to be able to get the point across that you want to get across. So use the best stories that you can come up with, and you might want to do some workshopping with that. If you want help adding stories into your talk, or you want help structuring and outlining your talk, please do get in touch. You can visit the new website, presentinfluence.com, or you can hit me up on LinkedIn. You will find links in the show notes to be able to do either of those. And I would love to hear from you. So please do feel free to get in touch. Now, if you're not already following the show, please do. I will be coming back with some more parts of the keynote creation process. I haven't really figured out how many episodes this is going to be in total. I don't want them to be super long episodes. This one probably already a bit longer than I had originally planned, but I do have some amazing interviews coming up. I have a conversation that I had with Cambodian about demo videos, and whether having a bad demo video is better than having no demo video as a speaker. Very interesting. I know you're going to love it. I absolutely love my conversation with Cam, and it's particularly helpful. I also had an interview with a lady called Lida Citron, who is an influence expert herself and has books on the topic. And I'm pretty sure you're going to enjoy that conversation too. And maybe you'll see that where we even had some slight points of disagreement, friendly disagreement, but there's a few things we didn't necessarily agree on there as well, which was definitely interesting to talk about. There's a whole bunch of interviews coming up which have just been fantastic. I'm so lucky with the guests that I'm able to get onto the show and the conversations that we're able to have, and I'm just doing my very best to keep them relevant and interesting for you as well. If that is of value to you and you want to listen to these episodes and more, make sure you're following the show. please do consider sharing the episode with your friends in your network as well. It certainly helps us. And if you haven't already, maybe leave the show a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Give us a 5-star review. And it helps other people, not just to find the show, but it helps other people to know that it's a good show and worth listening to. And if you think that, then I would certainly love to hear from you as well. And as always, wherever you're going, whatever you're doing, have an amazing week, and we'll see you next time.